My name is Emily Carter, Staff Sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. At the time this story happened, I had just returned from a 7-month deployment overseas. I was stationed at Marine Corps Base Quantico in Virginia, which meant I had grown used to the quiet rhythm of Northern Virginia life again. It's a strange transition, coming home. You spend months living in a world where every minute has structure and purpose, where your decisions can mean life or death, and where the bond with the person next to you is the only currency that matters. Then suddenly, you're back in ordinary life where people worry about traffic, grocery store lines, and lawn care. The mundane problems of civilian life can feel jarring after the high-stakes environment of a deployment. But that week, I had something much bigger on my mind than the usual reintegration struggles. I was finally going to meet Daniel Whitmore's parents. Daniel and I had been together for almost 2 years. We met through a mutual friend at a 4th of July barbecue in Fredericksburg. He was a civil engineer working for a construction firm, tall, thoughtful, and one of the most patient men I had ever known. He had a calmness to him that grounded me, a stability that I cherished. But his family, well, that was a different story. The Whitmores were the kind of family people in town talked about in hushed, respectful tones. Old Virginia money, a large colonial house outside Warrenton, horse property, charity boards, and golf club memberships. They were establishment, deeply rooted in tradition and appearances. Daniel had always been honest with me about them. He warned me that they were traditional, which was the polite way of saying they didn't exactly approve of a Marine dadding their son. His mother, Margaret, had asked him once, only half joking, "Don't you think you'd be happier with someone a little more refined?" His father, Harold, had been even more direct. During a phone call Daniel once put on speaker, I heard Harold say, "Son, a woman in the Marine Corps. That's not exactly the life I pictured for my future daughter-in-law." It was a clean, surgical cut, a dismissal of my entire existence based on my career choice. Daniel stood up for me every time. He was my fiercest defender, but I could tell the situation weighed on him. He was caught between the woman he loved and the family he was loyal to. So when he called me one evening, a week after I got back from deployment, I knew something important was coming. "Emily," he said, his voice tight with a mix of hope and anxiety. "My parents are hosting a dinner this Saturday." I leaned back on the couch in my small Quantico apartment, staring at the ceiling. "That sounds formal," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. "It is," he admitted, "but they want to meet you." I paused, letting the silence hang between us. "Or they want to inspect me?" I asked. Daniel chuckled softly, a sound that lacked real humor. "Maybe a little of both, but look, I know they've said some things that weren't fair, but if they actually meet you, Emily, they'll see what I see." That sentence stayed with me. They'll see what I see. I wanted that to be true. I wanted to believe that if I just showed up and was myself, their prejudices would melt away. I was about to learn that prejudice is rarely defeated by mere presence. It requires a shock to the system. Saturday afternoon, I left base early. I wanted to give myself plenty of time to prepare mentally. I traded my camouflage uniform for a simple navy dress and low heels. I packed a small overnight bag just in case and started the drive toward Warrenton. The October weather was perfect. Virginia in the fall is a beautiful thing. Cool air, golden leaves drifting across the road like confetti, long stretches of farmland glowing in the late afternoon sun. It felt cinematic. I remember thinking it was a good day for new beginnings, a day where maybe, just maybe, bridges could be built. The Whitmore house was about an hour away. I had calculated the route perfectly, giving myself a buffer for traffic. Plenty of time, or at least that's what I thought. Fate, however, had a different itinerary. About halfway there, just outside a small rural intersection, I noticed an old pickup truck pulled over on the side of the road. The hood was up, a beacon of distress against the green backdrop of the trees. An elderly man stood beside it, leaning into the engine bay with a look of stubborn determination. He was alone. Most cars drove right past him. It's a sad reality of modern life. People are in a hurry, suspicious of strangers, or simply too absorbed in their own lives to notice the struggles of others. For a moment, I did too. My foot hovered over the accelerator. I had a dinner to get to, an impression to make. I was already running on a tight schedule. Then my Marine instincts kicked in. It's a training that goes deeper than tactics. It's a moral code. You don't leave someone stranded if you can help it. You don't leave a man behind. That principle doesn't just apply to combat zones. I slowed down, pulled onto the shoulder, and stepped out. The man looked up, surprised. He was in his late 70s, maybe early 80s, with a face weathered by the sun and eyes that had seen a lot of miles. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. "You having trouble?" I asked, already scanning the scene. He gave a small, sheepish smile. "Truck overheated. Thought I could get her going again, but—" He shrugged, trailing off. The pickup looked old. A late 70s model, maybe. Solid truck, but clearly well used, a testament to a time when things were built to last but eventually succumbed to time. I glanced at the dashboard thermometer through the window. The engine block was still radiating heat. "Mind if I take a look?" I asked. He studied me for a second, his eyes lingering on the Marine Corps jacket I had thrown over my dress. Then he nodded slowly. "Well, now, I won't turn down help from a Marine." And that's how the whole thing started. If I had just kept driving that afternoon, none of the rest would have happened. I would have arrived on time, pristine and perfect, and the dinner would have likely been a polite, cold standoff that eventually ended with a handshake and a permanent distance between me and the Whitmores. But I stopped. And because I stopped, I was going to be late. Late enough to walk into the Whitmore dinner looking like I had crawled out from under a truck. Late enough for them to laugh at me. And late enough for something else entirely to happen. Something none of us could have expected. The old pickup truck looked like it had been on Virginia roads longer than I'd been alive. It was a faded forest green Ford, the kind of truck you rarely see anymore, except on old farms or in small towns where people keep things running long after most folks would have traded them in. The paint had chipped in places, the chrome bumper had a dent on one side, and the hood trembled slightly as heat rolled out of the engine compartment. The elderly man stepped back and wiped his hands again with the same rag. "Name's Frank," he said, extending a hand. "Emily," I replied, shaking it. His grip was firm. He nodded toward my jacket. "Marine Corps?" "Yes, sir." He smiled in a quiet, approving way. "Well, I'll be damned, haven't seen that eagle, globe, and anchor up close in a while." There was something about the way he said it that made me pause. It wasn't just recognition, it was camaraderie. "You serve?" I asked. He chuckled softly. "Long time ago. Vietnam." That explained the look in his eyes. I had seen it before with older veterans at the VFW hall outside Quantico. There's a certain calm weight people carry after they've lived through war. It's a heaviness, but also a resilience. I stepped closer to the engine and leaned over. The problem didn't take long to spot. The radiator hose had loosened just enough to leak coolant, and the engine had overheated while he was driving. It was a simple fix, but a messy one. "You were close to cooking this engine," I said. Frank sighed. "Yeah, she's been threatening to give up on me for years." "Let's see if we can buy her a few more," I said. I walked back to my car and grabbed the small tool pouch I kept in the trunk. Marines learn to fix things in the field, whether it's equipment, generators, or whatever breaks when you're miles from proper support. We don't have the luxury of waiting for a mechanic in a combat zone. Frank watched me tighten the hose clamp and refill what coolant was left. "You ever work on engines?" he asked, impressed. "Enough to get myself out of trouble," I said. He laughed. "Well, I'm glad someone knows what they're doing." While the engine cooled, we leaned against the truck and talked. The sun was starting to dip lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Frank told me he lived about 15 miles down the road in a small farmhouse that had been in his family since the 1950s. "Just me now," he said, his voice softening. "Wife passed 6 years ago." I nodded gently. "I'm sorry to hear that." He looked down at the gravel road for a moment, then gave a small smile. "Good woman, school teacher, kept me in line for 42 years. That made me smile. "What about you?" he asked. "Got family around here?" "Not really," I said. "I'm stationed at Quantico. And what brings you out to these country roads today?" I hesitated. I checked my watch. I was already running late. "Actually, I'm on my way to meet my boyfriend's parents." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Well, now that sounds serious." I gave a nervous laugh. "It is, first meeting, yes, sir." "Let me guess," he said, folding his arms and studying my face. "You're more nervous about that dinner than anything you faced overseas." I laughed again because he wasn't wrong. "Something like that." He studied me carefully. "They don't approve, they have their doubts." It wasn't a question, he saw right through me. Frank nodded slowly. "I've met that kind before." I didn't say anything, but he seemed to understand anyway. "People sometimes forget what real character looks like," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "They get distracted by the shine on the car or the cut of the suit." After a few minutes, the engine had cooled enough to test. I started the truck while Frank watched the hose connection. No leak. The engine settled into a steady, reassuring rumble. Frank let out a long breath of relief. "Well, I'll be." I shut the hood and stepped back, wiping my hands on my jeans. "That should get you home," I said. Frank stuck out his hand. I shook it. "Emily," he said, "I appreciate you stopping. Anyone would have done the same." He shook his head. "Not these days." I glanced at my watch and my stomach dropped. I was already 20 minutes late. "Shoot," I muttered. Frank noticed. "Dinner running without you, probably." He gave me a sympathetic look. "Well, then we better not keep them waiting." I smiled and grabbed my tool pouch. As I climbed back into my car, Frank leaned through the window. "Emily." "Yes, sir," he pointed down the road. "Those people you're going to meet, they're about to see what kind of woman their son picked." I smiled politely. "I hope so." Then I started the engine and pulled back onto the road. I drove away, watching him in the rearview mirror, an old man standing by his truck, waving. I had no idea that our paths were about to cross again in the most dramatic way possible. The sun was lower now, casting long orange shadows across the fields. I drove faster than I probably should have, glancing at the clock every few minutes. 30 minutes late, then 35. The anxiety was a tight knot in my stomach. By the time I turned onto the long gravel drive leading to the Whitmore estate, I knew I had already made a terrible first impression. The house looked exactly like Daniel had described. White columns, wide front porch, lights glowing warmly through the tall windows, several expensive cars already parked in the circular driveway. It looked less like a family dinner and more like a formal gathering of the elite. I stepped out of the car and suddenly realized something. My hands. They were still stained with grease, and the front of my Marine Corps jacket wasn't much better. I looked down at my dress. A smear of dirt on the hem. I tried wiping my hands with a napkin from the glove compartment, but it barely helped. The grease was stubborn, a reminder of the good deed that had derailed my schedule. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like a mess, too late now. I took a breath, squared my shoulders, and walked toward the front door. I was a Marine. I had faced worse than a dinner party. I could handle this. The moment I stepped inside, I could hear voices from the dining room. Laughter, silverware clinking, conversation already well underway. Daniel appeared from the hallway the moment he saw me. His eyes widened. "Emily, I was getting worried." Then he noticed the grease. His face fell. "What happened?" I gave a small shrug, trying to play it cool. "Long story, car trouble, not mine." He smiled softly, his eyes full of relief. "Honestly, I'm just glad you're here." Before I could say anything else, another voice spoke from the dining room. It was sharp, clear, and carried the weight of authority. "Daniel," a woman called out, "is that your guest?" Daniel squeezed my hand. "Ready," he whispered. I nodded. We stepped into the dining room together, and every conversation at the table stopped. 10 pairs of eyes turned toward me. The silence was absolute. I saw the moment Margaret Whitmore noticed the grease on my jacket. Her lips curled into a thin smile, and that was when the laughing started. The laughter wasn't loud at first. It started as a few quiet chuckles from the far end of the table. The kind people try to hide behind a napkin or a glass of wine. But in a silent dining room, even small laughs carry. I felt them like little taps against my pride. Daniel squeezed my hand again as if to steady me. "Everyone," he said carefully, his voice a bit too loud. "This is Emily." I stood there in the doorway of the Whitmore dining room, painfully aware of every detail about myself. My boots still had a bit of dust from the roadside. My Marine Corps jacket had grease smudges across one sleeve. My hands were cleaner than they had been earlier, but the stains hadn't completely disappeared, and the room around me looked like something out of a magazine. A long, polished wooden table stretched down the center, set with crystal glasses and neatly folded linen napkins. The lighting was warm and elegant, reflecting off framed paintings on the walls. A roasted chicken sat on a silver serving platter in the middle of the table. Everyone else looked perfect. Pressed shirts, elegant dresses, hair neatly styled. And then there was me. Margaret Whitmore stood at the head of the table beside her husband. She was a tall woman with silver hair styled neatly at the back of her head. Her eyes traveled slowly from my boots to my face. She tilted her head. "Well," she said softly, her voice dripping with condescension, "you certainly made an entrance." A couple people laughed again. Daniel cleared his throat. "Emily ran into a little trouble on the way here." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Oh," I stepped forward trying to keep my voice calm. There was a man broken down on Route 17, I said. His truck overheated. I stopped to help. For a moment, the room was quiet. Then someone down the table said quietly, "How noble." It didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like a joke. Margaret folded her hands politely. "That's very kind of you, Emily," she said, "though I imagine most people would have called roadside assistance." The implication was clear. Why would you get your hands dirty when you could pay someone else to do it? I didn't respond. I just held her gaze. Daniel pulled out a chair beside him. "Why don't you sit down?" he said gently. I sat. As I did, Harold Whitmore finally spoke. He had the kind of voice that filled a room without needing to be raised. It was a voice used to giving orders. "So," he said, studying me, "you're the Marine." "Yes, sir," I replied. He leaned back in his chair, inspecting me like a specimen under a microscope. I'll admit Daniel's choice surprised us. Daniel shifted beside me. "Dad," but Harold raised a hand slightly, silencing his son. "I'm simply being honest," he said. Then he looked at me again. "And honesty is something Marines value, isn't it?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Well, then," he continued calmly, "I suppose we can start with the obvious question." The table had gone completely silent again. Everyone was leaning in, waiting for the blood sport. "What exactly do you plan to do once this military phase of yours is over?" I blinked. "Sir," he gestured vaguely toward my uniform, "this sort of life doesn't last forever. Eventually, people settle down, build families." Margaret added gently, "We've always believed stability is important." One of the women across the table nodded, "Especially for young couples." Daniel sighed quietly, but I answered honestly. "I've built my career in the Marine Corps," I said. "I plan to continue serving as long as I can." Harold studied me like a man examining a business proposal. "Interesting," he mused. "I suppose Daniel finds that exciting." Another small ripple of laughter moved around the table. It was a humiliation ritual. They were dismantling my life choices, dismantling me, piece by piece, with polite smiles and soft voices. Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's not fair," he said. Margaret gave him a calming look. "We're only trying to understand her background." She turned back to me. "Tell me, Emily, where did you grow up?" "Ohio," I said. "A small town. And what did your parents do?" "My father worked in a factory. My mother was a nurse." Margaret smiled politely, but I could see the judgment hiding behind it. "Well," she said, "hardworking people." Harold took a bite of chicken before speaking again. "You must admit Daniel comes from a rather different environment." Daniel leaned forward. "Dad," but Harold continued. "We raised him with certain expectations." His eyes moved again to my grease-stained sleeve. "I imagine dinner parties like this aren't exactly common in the Marine Corps." Someone near the end of the table laughed out loud that time. I felt Daniel's hand tense beside mine, but I kept my voice steady. "No, sir," I said. "They're not." Margaret sighed lightly as if trying to smooth the moment. "Well, let's not dwell on awkward beginnings." She gestured toward the food. "Please, everyone, let's eat." Plates began to move again. Conversations slowly restarted, but I could still feel the occasional glance drifting toward my jacket, my hands, my presence at the table. At one point, Margaret leaned toward the woman sitting next to her and whispered something. The woman covered her mouth as she laughed. I focused on my plate. Across from me, Daniel looked apologetic. "I'm really sorry," he whispered. "It's okay," I said quietly. But the truth was, I felt smaller in that room than I had in a very long time. Not because of their wealth, not because of their house, but because they had already decided who I was before I ever walked through the door. And nothing I said seemed likely to change their minds. I was regretting stopping for that truck. I was regretting coming here. The injustice of it burned in my throat. I had spent the afternoon doing something good, something selfless, and I was being punished for it. I was being mocked for the evidence of my kindness. Dinner went on like that for another 20 minutes. Polite conversation, subtle comments, a few jokes that weren't really jokes. The tension was a physical weight in the air, until suddenly the sound of tires crunching on gravel drifted through the open dining room window. At first, no one paid attention. Cars come and go. But the engine noise grew louder. It was a distinct sound, a rough, rhythmic chugging that didn't belong in this neighborhood of luxury vehicles. Someone outside closed a car door with a heavy thud, and a moment later, the front door of the house opened without a knock. Footsteps echoed through the hallway, heavy, deliberate steps. I heard an older voice call out, "Hello, anyone home?" Daniel frowned slightly. Margaret looked confused, and Harold Whitmore slowly turned his head toward the doorway. A second later, the elderly man I had helped on the side of the road stepped into the dining room. For a moment, no one spoke. The elderly man stood in the doorway holding his cap in one hand. The dining room lights caught the deep lines in his face and the worn denim jacket he wore over a faded plaid shirt. It took me half a second to recognize him. Frank, the same man whose truck I had fixed less than an hour earlier. My first thought was simple confusion. What on earth was he doing here? How did he find me? Did he follow me? Frank looked around the room with mild curiosity, as if he had walked into a gathering he hadn't quite expected. "Well now," he said, his voice warm and steady. "Looks like supper time." Then his eyes landed on me. A smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Emily." Every head in the room turned toward me again. I felt Daniel shift beside me. "You know him," he whispered, his voice incredulous. Before I could answer, Frank continued walking into the room. And that was when everything changed. Harold Whitmore pushed his chair back so quickly it scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. Then he stood up. Not slowly, not casually. He stood up the way soldiers stand when a commanding officer walks into the room. It was instinctual, a reflex buried deep in his muscle memory. The rest of the table followed almost immediately. One by one, chairs moved. People stood. Margaret Whitmore rose too, though her expression had shifted from confident amusement to something much more uncertain. Daniel looked just as confused as I felt. "Mr. Miller," Harold said, his voice completely different now. It was respectful, deferential, almost awed. Frank gave him a friendly nod. "Evening, Harold." The casual way he said Harold's name seemed to surprise everyone at the table. These were men of equal standing, or perhaps Frank was the senior. Harold stepped forward quickly. "I didn't realize you were stopping by tonight." Frank shrugged. "Wasn't planning to." He glanced back at me again. "But I had a reason." Margaret looked from Frank to me and back again. "You two know each other?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Frank chuckled. "Met about 40 minutes ago." Now the confusion around the table was complete. Harold frowned slightly. "On the road," Frank nodded. "Truck overheated on Route 17. He gestured toward me. "This Marine right here pulled over and fixed it." Every eye in the room returned to me. The silence felt different now, heavier. It wasn't the silence of judgment, it was the silence of shock. Frank stepped further into the room. "You've got a good one here, Harold," he said calmly. Harold blinked. "I'm sorry." Frank leaned his cap against the back of an empty chair. "This young woman," he continued, "stopped on a rural road when half a dozen other cars drove past." He looked around the table, making eye contact with each guest. "She didn't ask who I was, didn't care what I drove, didn't care how old my truck was. She just helped." No one spoke. Frank nodded toward my grease-stained sleeve. "That's why she looks like she crawled out from under an engine." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. The laughter from earlier seemed to echo in their memories, taunting them. Frank's tone wasn't angry, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that comes from someone who has spent a lifetime being listened to. Harold cleared his throat. "Well, that was certainly kind of her." Frank turned slowly toward him. "You remember what we used to say in the Corps?" Harold froze. It was a subtle shift, but I saw it, a recognition of history. Frank continued. "Character shows up when nobody's watching." Now I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The way Harold Whitmore stood in front of Frank, straight, almost rigid, like an old habit had come back without him thinking about it. Daniel leaned toward me. "Wait," he whispered. "Do you know who that is?" I shook my head slightly. "That's Frank Miller," Daniel breathed. "He owns half the valley. He's a war hero. He saved Dad's life in Vietnam." The pieces clicked into place. Frank pulled out a chair and sat down casually. Margaret still looked lost. "Frank," she said carefully, "would you like to join us for dinner?" Frank smiled. "Well, I wasn't planning to interrupt anything." He glanced around the table, though it looked like things were getting interesting. A few people avoided his eyes. Harold slowly sat again. "Yes, well." Frank folded his hands calmly on the table. "Emily here told me she was on her way to meet her boyfriend's parents." His eyes moved around the room. "Funny thing is, she never mentioned they were you folks." Margaret blinked. Daniel finally spoke. "Mr. Miller, I'm Daniel." Frank smiled warmly. "Good to meet you, son." Then he leaned back slightly in his chair. "You picked a strong partner." Daniel nodded slowly. "I believe I did." Frank looked back at Harold again. "Harold," he said quietly. "Yes, sir," Harold replied automatically. A few guests exchanged surprised looks. the head of the Whitmore family, saying sir to the old man in the denim jacket. Frank tilted his head slightly. You remember a night in Quang Tri Province in 1968? The room went completely still. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Harold's face changed. I saw recognition hit him like a memory he hadn't visited in years. His face went pale. Yes, he said softly. Frank nodded. That was the night your patrol got pinned down. Harold didn't speak. He just stared at Frank. Frank continued calmly. You were 22 years old, a young lieutenant trying to get your men home alive. He paused. And the Marine who pulled you out of that ditch. Frank tapped the table lightly. That was me. No one in the room moved. The revelation hung in the air, electric and undeniable. Frank looked around the table slowly. So when I say this young Marine has character, he gestured toward me again, I know exactly what I'm talking about. Harold Whitmore lowered his eyes. And for the first time that evening, the man who had been laughing at me looked ashamed. He looked absolutely crushed by the weight of his own rudeness. The room stayed silent for a long moment after Frank finished speaking. Not the polite silence from earlier in the evening. This one felt different. Heavy, reflective, the kind of silence that settles over a room when people suddenly realize they might have been wrong. I sat there unsure what to do with my hands. 20 minutes earlier, those same people had been laughing at the grease on my jacket. Now, no one seemed able to look at it. The grease had become a badge of honor. It was the proof of my character. It was the very thing they had mocked, now validated by the man they revered. Frank leaned back slightly in his chair, completely at ease, like a man who had walked into a familiar place rather than a room full of stunned dinner guests. Margaret Whitmore cleared her throat. Well, Frank, she said carefully, we didn't realize Emily had helped you. Frank gave a small shrug. She didn't know who I was. He looked around the table again. That's what made it matter. Daniel's hand slipped quietly over mine under the table. I could feel the pride in the way he squeezed my fingers. Across the table, Harold Whitmore still hadn't fully recovered from the story Frank had just told. He stared down at his plate for a moment before slowly lifting his head again. Frank, he said quietly, I didn't expect to see you tonight. Frank smiled faintly. Life has a funny way of arranging meetings. He gestured toward me again. If she hadn't stopped on that road, I'd still be sitting beside that old truck waiting for a tow truck. Margaret's posture softened slightly. Well, she said, we're certainly grateful she helped you. Frank tilted his head toward her. You should be. There was no accusation in his voice, but the meaning was clear enough. You should be grateful, and you should be ashamed of how you treated her. The guests around the table shifted in their chairs. The earlier laughter had disappeared completely. One of the older men sitting near the end of the table leaned forward. Frank Miller, he said slowly. You're the Frank Miller, aren't you? Frank gave him a puzzled look. I suppose that depends on which one you mean. The Veterans Foundation, the man said. The one that built the rehabilitation center in town. Frank nodded casually. That was a group effort. The man looked impressed. I've read about you in the paper. Margaret turned slightly toward Harold. You never mentioned Frank was involved with the foundation. Harold gave a quiet sigh. He's involved in a lot of things. Frank waved the comment away. I stay busy. Then he glanced back toward me again. Mostly because people like Emily here remind me why it matters. That sentence landed differently than the others. Frank wasn't just praising me anymore. He was teaching the room something. He was using this moment to deliver a lesson in humility and grace. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Mr. Miller, he said, Emily told you she was coming here tonight. Frank nodded. She mentioned meeting her boyfriend's family. Daniel gave a small smile. Well, I'm the boyfriend. Frank chuckled. Then you've made a good choice, son. Daniel looked genuinely proud. I know. Margaret reached for her wine glass, but I noticed her hand had lost the confident steadiness it had earlier in the evening. It trembled slightly. Emily, she said gently. We had no idea you'd stop to help someone, I answered honestly. It didn't seem like something worth mentioning. Frank looked at me and nodded. That right there, he said softly, is exactly why it matters. Harold rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Then he looked across the table at me. I owe you an apology. The words seemed difficult for him. He had to force them out. Earlier that evening, he had been completely certain of himself. Now he looked like a man reconsidering everything he had assumed. I judged you too quickly, he continued. You walked in late and I drew conclusions. I held his gaze. That happens sometimes. Harold nodded slowly. Frank leaned forward slightly. You know, Harold, he said, I remember another young Marine people underestimated once. Harold raised an eyebrow. Oh, Frank pointed directly at him. You. A few guests smiled faintly. Frank continued, when I first met you in Vietnam, you were barely old enough to shave. Harold chuckled quietly. That's not entirely inaccurate. Frank nodded. Some of the older officers didn't think you'd last a month. Harold looked surprised. I didn't know that. Frank smiled. Most leaders never hear what people say before they prove themselves. He gestured toward me again. Emily's already proven something important. Margaret looked curious. What's that? Frank answered calmly. That she'll do the right thing even when nobody's watching. The table stayed quiet again. Then Daniel spoke. That's exactly who she is. His voice carried quiet pride. Margaret looked at her son, then back at me. I could see the shift happening in her mind. Not dramatic, not sudden, but real. Well, she said slowly, it seems tonight we may have misjudged our guest. Frank gave a small smile. Seems that way. Harold finally picked up his fork again. Then he looked at me across the table. Emily, he said, I'd like to start this evening over. He gestured toward the empty chair beside Daniel. If you're willing, I nodded. I am. And for the first time since I had walked into that house, the tension in the room began to ease. But the biggest change wasn't in the room. It was in the way Harold Whitmore looked at me. Earlier that night, he had seen a Marine who didn't belong. Now he was seeing something else entirely, something he recognized. Character. Dinner resumed slowly after that. Not in the stiff, uncomfortable way it had earlier in the evening, but with the careful pace of people who were reconsidering their earlier judgments. Margaret asked the housekeeper to bring another place setting, and Frank settled comfortably into a chair near the center of the table. The roasted chicken was passed again along with bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans, and the quiet clinking of silverware returned to the room. But the tone had changed. Earlier, the conversations had felt like an evaluation. Now they felt like a conversation. Frank seemed perfectly comfortable sitting among the Whitmores and their guests. He ate slowly, occasionally sharing small stories about the town, the Veterans Center, or the farm where he still lived. More than once someone at the table asked him questions, but every so often he would bring the conversation back around to me. So Emily, he said at one point, how long you been in the Corps? Almost 9 years, I replied. Staff sergeant already, he said with a nod. That's no small thing. Harold looked at me with new interest. 9 years, he repeated. That means you enlisted young. I was 18, I said. What made you choose the Marines? It was a fair question and one I'd answered many times over the years. My father served in the Army, I explained. When I was younger, I watched how much pride he had in that time. When I graduated high school, I wanted to challenge myself. Frank chuckled. You picked the toughest branch to do that. I did. Margaret leaned forward slightly. And you've been deployed. Yes, ma'am, to where? Mostly the Middle East. Margaret nodded slowly. I can't imagine that life. I shrugged gently. It's not easy sometimes, but it's meaningful. Frank lifted his glass. That it is. The guests at the table listened with growing attention. Earlier, they had seemed amused by my presence. Now they were curious, respectful. One of the men across the table asked about life on base. Another asked about leadership in the military. Someone else asked what it was like training young Marines. I answered each question calmly. I was no longer the punchline. I was a guest of honor. By the time dessert was served, the evening felt completely different from the one I had walked into. Margaret brought out a homemade apple pie, still warm with vanilla ice cream melting slowly over each slice. The tension that had filled the dining room earlier had softened into something quieter and more genuine. People were talking again, but now the conversation sounded relaxed instead of careful. Frank was telling a story about a fishing trip he'd taken years ago with some Marines from the Veterans Center. A few of the guests laughed as he described one of them falling into the lake. After insisting, he knew exactly how to steer a small boat. Daniel sat beside me with his arm resting lightly on the back of my chair. Every once in a while, he would glance at me and smile like he still couldn't quite believe how the evening had turned around. Across the table, Harold Whitmore watched Frank finish his story, then he cleared his throat. Frank, he said quietly, I never properly thanked you. Frank looked up. For what? For that night in Vietnam. The room grew still again. Frank waved a hand casually. That was a long time ago. Harold shook his head. Not to me. He paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. You saved my life. Frank studied him quietly, then he gave a small nod. Well, that's what Marines do. Harold smiled faintly. And apparently, he added, glancing toward me, it's still what they do. Margaret turned toward me with a gentler expression than the one she had worn earlier that evening. Emily, she said, I want to apologize again. Her voice was sincere. When you walked through that door tonight, I saw someone who didn't fit the picture I had in my mind. She folded her hands together on the table, and instead of asking questions, I made assumptions. I nodded slightly. It happens. She gave a small, regretful smile. Yes, but it shouldn't. Daniel leaned forward. Mom, Emily is pretty used to people underestimating her. Frank chuckled. Most good Marines are. Margaret looked at me again. Well, I'm very glad you stopped to help Frank today. She paused. And I'm very glad you came to dinner. Harold nodded in agreement. I'd like to say the same. He leaned back in his chair and studied me thoughtfully. You know, he said, when Daniel first told us about you, I worried. I raised an eyebrow. About what? He smiled slightly. That you might not fit into our world. Frank gave a soft laugh. Harold glanced toward him. But tonight reminded me of something important. He tapped the table lightly. The world doesn't need more people who fit into the same mold. Frank lifted his fork. It needs people with character. Harold nodded. Exactly. He turned back to me. And I can see now why my son cares about you. Daniel looked both relieved and amused. Well, that's good to hear. Margaret smiled warmly. Yes, it is. Frank finished the last bite of pie and wiped his hands with his napkin. You know, he said thoughtfully, nights like this remind me of something my father used to say. Everyone looked toward him. He used to say that a person's true character shows up in the quiet moments. He pointed toward the window where the graveled driveway stretched into the darkness. Like stopping on a country road to help a stranger. He looked at me. That's the kind of thing people remember. I felt a quiet warmth in my chest hearing that. Not pride exactly, just the feeling that maybe I had done something small that mattered. Daniel squeezed my hand again. I already knew that about her, he said. Harold smiled. Well, I'm glad we know it now, too. The evening slowly began to wind down after that. Coats were gathered. Guests thanked Margaret for dinner. Cars pulled away from the long gravel driveway one by one. Frank stood near the front door as he prepared to leave. Before stepping outside, he turned toward me. Emily, he said. Yes, sir. You ever get out toward the Veterans Center in Warrenton? Not often. You should. He nodded toward Harold. This old lieutenant here helps run a few programs for younger veterans. Harold chuckled. Trying to give back a little. Frank smiled. People like Emily are exactly the kind of leaders those programs need. Harold looked thoughtful. Well, he said, I'd be honored if you ever wanted to stop by. I'd like that, I replied. Frank tipped his cap slightly. Good. Then he stepped outside into the cool Virginia night. Daniel and I stood on the porch watching his old truck rumble down the gravel driveway. For a moment, we just listened to the quiet countryside. Then Daniel looked at me. You know, he said, that might be the most dramatic dinner my family has ever had. I laughed softly. I'm glad it ended the way it did. He nodded. Me too. As we walked back inside, I thought about how the whole evening had unfolded. It would have been easy to hold on to resentment, easy to be angry about the laughter or the assumptions. But life has a funny way of teaching people lessons when they least expect it. Sometimes the best kind of revenge isn't about proving someone wrong with anger. Sometimes it's simply about showing them who you truly are and letting your actions speak louder than their expectations ever could. The grease on my jacket wasn't a stain. It was a medal. It was the proof that when the world gave me a choice between being comfortable and being kind, I chose kindness. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. If this story reminded you of someone who showed kindness when it mattered most, I hope you'll share it with them. And if you believe that character still matters in this world, I'd be honored if you followed along for more stories like this one. Because sometimes the smallest moments, like stopping on a quiet country road, can change everything.